Hello, welcome. We are having some technical difficulties tonight, so just bear with us. I am Carrie Lund, the director of the Pursuit of History, and here with me tonight is Karen Chase, and we are hoping that Lee will be able to join us soon. So Karen, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here. This is fun. I've not done this before.
Yes, it's a new adventure.
It is. It all is.
Definitely. So, yes. So last week we got a little sneak peek of what we're going to talk about tonight about your book Carrying Independence.
Right.
So why don't we just kind of jump in and talk about the history of this, and what kind of got you interested, and some of the fascinating things you found along the way, because whenever you do historical research you find a lot of interesting things that maybe weren't expected.
You do. And especially for me, I think, oh, they've got people chiming in. I see people. That's fun. So yeah, the research, it started a long time ago. The book came out last June, and I started the project 10 years ago was when the idea came to me, of all times, I think we talked about it in the preview, when I was on a tour of Berkeley Plantation, which is built and was owned by Benjamin Harrison, who was one of the signers of the Declaration. And the docent on the tour I was on just said that, this Declaration of Independence. Oh, I think Lee's joining us. The Declaration of
I think
Independence.
so.
Should we wait? Lee, are you coming in? Maybe. I hope everybody be patient. This is a first for everyone, I think, including Facebook, it seems.
Right.
All right. Well, we'll just keep going. So the declaration
Yep.
the tour docent said was not signed by all the men on the same day. And first, to discover that it wasn't signed on July 4th, like we're all taught in history class, we should be honoring July 4th because that's the Declaration Day. That's not at all. And it was signed on August 2nd. And, it's like today. We have trouble getting everybody to come at once. And it was the same thing for them. Imagine, trying to get 56 people from 13 different states together today, right now. It was darn near impossible. The fact that they managed to get as many as they did was amazing, but 7 of them were unable to come for health, for war reasons. And when the docent on the tour said they weren't all there, and perhaps, who knows how it got signed, he said, maybe it got carried to them. And I thought, what a great story that would be. And hi, Leslie. That's my friend Leslie chiming in. She was the one that did all the interior design and setup work of the book, so I'm glad to see you here, honey. Yeah, it was an interesting fact for me that not all the men were there, and I thought, well, is that true? First of all, and second of all, if it's not true, hi Patty, if it's not true, if it is true that they weren't there, then how did they sign it? And it didn't take much sleuthing to determine that historians really haven't been able to fix exactly where those 7 men were when they signed it. Even when I went to Colonial Williamsburg, where George Wythe lived, and I knew that he was not one of the men in attendance on August 2nd. One docent in one part of the park told me, oh, he absolutely went to Philadelphia to sign that document. And another one said, no, he signed it right here at his home. And I thought, well, if they don't know, then I guess I get to pick. So it was a fascinating history to me. And with all the, I like what I call holes in history, where either the historians are arguing over possibilities, or we really don't know, but we've surmised and everyone kind of agrees that that might have been the way it went down. As a novelist, that just gives really an open run on what you want to do with that. But for me, being the person that likes to create a novel that is adhering to the history as much as possible, holes had to be filled delicately. Let's put it that way.
Right. Right. So let's talk about Nathaniel Martin, who is a man that you created for this novel, and he was hired to carry the document to Congress. In 1776, would they have been looking for, what would they have been looking for in such a person? And how did you decide on the background for him?
Right. So he was a fiction. Like I said, they really don't know how those men affix their signatures. And I thought, really, uh, given how important that document was, because they figured it was a contract. It was a one document with all the signatures. And a lot of the men who signed it were merchants and lawyers. And I really figured if they were going to agree on how to get that document signed, they were going to be very careful about who they picked. And I know that the Congress at the time had what a number of different committees. They had a committee of correspondence, for instance, and that committee was established to increase communications with potential allies like France. And they had, but they were all called secret committees. So it was the secret committee of correspondence and the secret committee of these variety of things. And so I thought the secret carrying committee sounded like something that they might enact. And of course, then at one of my early drafts, I had an argument between Benjamin Franklin and John Dickinson and a number of congressmen about what this person should be like. Eventually, that translated, that got thrown out, that big conversation, and pieces of it put into a conversation they have in front of Nathaniel when he delivers a letter to them. And I thought, well, first of all, the person, if they hired one single person, would have to have an understanding of post roads. They'd have to understand the structure of the colonies. They'd have to understand the sanctity of mail, that you don't look in it or you don't really ask too many questions. And on top of that, he would have to have some skills like being able to protect himself, which a lot of the post writers did. I mean, we saw a lot of results coming out of 1776 with spies that were being accosted on the road and their messages taken and changed and then delivered incorrectly. So I wanted him to be very savvy about what he did. And I went about looking for a mail delivery person. But at the time, the postal system, if there's a post office in Baltimore and they've got to deliver a letter to Philadelphia, there was a post rider that went back and forth and they didn't vary their trails too much. But Berks County, Pennsylvania was one of the few places in the colonies that did not have an established post office. So they had what they called express riders, and these guys kind of picked up mail wherever it needed to be picked up and delivered it to wherever it needed to be delivered. And consequently, they just had a bit more wanderlust, I think, to them than your average straight run post rider that just was doing like a relay between other post riders.
Right.
So I wanted him to have that unknownness. And then, right away, as soon as the guy in Berkeley plantation had mentioned they weren't all there and maybe it was carried, right away, I knew full well the person that would accept that job would probably not want to fight in the war. And that's not from a history perspective, but from a novelist perspective. It's to have a guy that's all gung-ho and into the patriot cause and just wants to carry the Declaration and fully understands everything about it does not make for great reading. Not in the fiction
world. Conflict that he's got to work through. He has some conflict he's got to work through.
Right. So if a guy is really, he's cornered into a position of taking up the Declaration versus picking up a rifle, which he would shoot at whom? His mother, who's English, a neighbor who's Shawnee, a friend who's Irish, his father who's German, who signs an oath and who doesn't at that time was really important. So understanding his motivations as an individual allowed me to see that, kind of like our time, we're not all in one camp or another. There's a third position. And we're all going to face that when we go to the elections this November, right? There's two camps, and you should be voting for one or the other. But there's always like this party that is separate from everything else. or people who are separate from everything else, and say, now I just feel like I must abstain altogether. And that was going on then too. Some people, some different academics put it at a third, and a third. A third for revolution, a third against and staying with the king, and a third just on the fence. And to me, that was a much more interesting position for Nathaniel to be in. And then, of course, I wanted to
well,
What's that?
A lot of people were in that position, and it's something we can all relate to because life isn't a simple black and white.
It's not. It's not. And it wasn't then, especially when it came to signing oaths. I mean, if someone put a piece of paper in front of me right now and they said I had to choose, it'd be between separate, like if the U.S. was going to, half the U.S. was going to separate and I could stay East Coast or go West Coast, what would you do? What would you do?
Right. Right, definitely.
I mean, first you test the weather.
Not easy. So, what other aspects of the Declaration versus the other founding documents came as a surprise to you?
I think what came as a real surprise was finding out how little people knew about the documents. And I thought, and I'm sure we'll get back to this, that I'm Canadian, and I thought I just didn't know because I hadn't had the right schooling. But I was surprised at how many times I told people that I was working on a book about the Declaration of Independence. Then I would hear comments like, "Oh, are you going to address gun rights?" And I'm like, that's not this document. That's not even really the Constitution. That is the Bill of Rights. So, I think that was some of my surprise, is how many people really wanted to know. That was the other thing. As I was talking to people about writing on the book, they would say, "So what is the difference? Tell me the difference." Some of the grievances, that there are 27 grievances in the Declaration of Independence listed against the king. I always call this the biggest Dear John breakup letter in history. The way that the format of the Declaration, and those who have chimed in, who've seen me present, I talk about this in my presentations. The format of the presentation is like a teenage breakup letter. So there's the preamble to the Declaration, which is all the things that the teenage girl thought a relationship was going to be. I thought it was going to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I thought it was going to be all men are created equal. That's the preamble. And then the second section is the list of grievances, which is essentially like all the things the boyfriend's done wrong. And in this case, it was the king. And there were 27 of them. It was like billeting soldiers in your home. It was the fact that he was increasing insurgents among Native Americans. There were a lot of different grievances in there that I was surprised by. The Stamp Act, of course, is just one of them, but the taxation without representation is the one we all hang our hat on the most. And then after the grievances comes the Declaration itself, which is in the teenage breakup letter, where the girl says, "Therefore, based on all the above and all my vain appeals, all my wishing that you were a better boyfriend, it's not going to happen. So we're through. And I'm going to go on to bigger and better things with all my girlfriends," basically. And that's what we did. And then there's the big signature sign off at the bottom, or as I call it, the big kiss off. There's always there's a legend that John Hancock wrote his signature the biggest, and when he did it, he said, "Well, there, now the king can see my signature from his house," essentially. It's not true, but it's really fun to think about him possibly doing that.
Right. And it kind of works with John Hancock, just bigger.
Just bigger, yeah, the bigger clothes, everything, yeah.
Right. So I think you are writing a series. This is the first in a series of 3 books about the founding documents. And did that sort of come about from those questions people asked you?
A little bit. It started too because when I took that tour of Berkeley Plantation, where I got the idea in the first place, it actually had a story in mind regarding the Constitution. And I still liked the story. I realize now I didn't know as much as I should have about the time period, which is also after that tour where I went back and started on the Declaration. I thought, well, you're going to write a book about the Constitution. You probably ought to understand the first document first. Um, so,
Right.
but the Constitution story, the next book is called A Letter of Introduction. And I have quite an outline already done for it, but it was actually the one that I began with. So it made sense to do a book of three. I don't have my Bill of Rights story yet, but I have no doubt it will find me.
It will. It will definitely. Okay, so let's go back to something you mentioned a minute ago. You are Canadian.
I am.
So let's talk about that and your connection to American history here.
So as a kid, I know full well I hit the parent jackpot. My mom and dad. My dad was a physics teacher, physics and math teacher, and my mom didn't work, but she was a voracious reader, and among other things. And they decided that we were going to be traveling as a family. I don't know exactly what the moment was that sparked that for them. Probably a good thing to ask next time I see them. But yeah, so they, during my childhood, from the time I was about 7 until I was 17, we traveled in an RV every summer for 8 to 10 weeks at a time. And
Hmm.
by the time I was 17, I'd seen 44 states and 9 provinces. And my parents, because my father was a teacher and my mother was bookish, it was not just amusement parks. We were at battlefields and we were in museums and we were seeing historic sites and taking tours of Boeing plants and Kellogg's plants. And so, how things worked and how America grew, I grew up on it. And um, that really sparked my interest in American history right from a young age. Uh, I was reading while we were on those summer vacations, reading Agatha Christie, reading a lot of historical fiction. And so as I grew up, like the two just began to merge. And when this Constitution book came around and I started working on it, I was just, I didn't know quite yet how deep my roots went. And I kept going to all these historical places like Annapolis, where George Washington resigned his commission. And there on the floor is a marker saying that they think that this is the spot where he stood. And the marker was put there by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And I kept running into
Hmm.
these plaques from these women because they love to put plaques on anything. And I love them for doing that. And so they've restored so many buildings and they put so much into the education of the American Revolutionary period, especially. And so I'm on the phone one night with my parents and I'm telling them, thank goodness for the Daughters of the American Revolution, man. They were making my job easier. And both of my parents told me, you might be one. Uh, and so they sent me some of the paperwork, and my mother came down and helped me fill some of the stuff out. And it turns out I am. I had a patriot who fought in the American Revolution, uh, Joseph Clark, and he's from the New York area, and he was a senator around the time of the Revolution. But Nathan Chase, which is kind of where Nathaniel came from, the name. Nathan Chase was on my Chase side. So if you were up in the Fort Plains area, anybody out there, Fort Clock is up there. KLOCK. That is my family.
Nice.
Yeah,
That's a fun connection. That was probably really fun to discover.
it was. It was really cool. And it's, I'm learning a little bit more about them. And I've since met a woman from New York, Nancy, who turns out to be my cousin from that time period. Her ancestor, her patriot, was my patriot's brother. So she's helping me fill in
Oh,
that. I'm sorry, it was Jacob Clock. Jacob G. Clock was my ancestor. So, yeah.
that's neat.
Yeah, it's really so. I think, initially I came to it because I had a passion for it, and then it turned out I had a lineage for it. So it's, and the DAR. Oh my gosh! Since I think I was on draft 3 or 2 when I found out that the DAR, I was one of them, and they helped
Yeah.
me immensely with the research, introducing me to docents so I could take behind the scenes tours and things like that that I never would have had before. And they were an invaluable resource for me.
Oh, that is very helpful. That's wonderful. Perfect.
Yeah,
They do a lot of great work, for sure.
they do a lot of great work. And there's 185,000 of them. So if you ever have a question,
They can help.
yeah.
Definitely. That is great.
I guess I should say there's
So,
185,000 of us, huh?
right. Definitely. Okay, so your novel takes place during the whole year of 1776.
Right.
Um, and you have done that from 4 different perspectives besides Nathaniel. So how did you kind of approach that, and what were you trying to bring into the book?
Well, initially, in like I was saying, some of my earlier drafts, it was just Nathaniel, and what I found was happening was the conversation was sticking primarily to what does the document mean, and how do we get it signed, and that doesn't make for very rich reading, but it also makes for a really siloed examination of the American Revolution, especially that first year.
Mm-hmm.
And so having some different perspectives allowed me to really take the book from just being about this guy who wants to carry a document to really being a treatise, if you will, on 1776. And some of that came as I was touring the different places that I wanted to feature in the book where the signers were, because I went to all of them from as far south as Yorktown all the way up to Litchfield, Connecticut. And as I was traveling and going through these places, I realized that sometimes what happens when a character is not in the room allows us to see a very different side of the conflict. So Nathaniel's best friend, Arthur, who I think was fully in the Patriot camp right from the get-go, he really, in my head, I've always described him as the guy who bears the brunt of the war. Arthur is
Mm-hmm.
the character who allowed me to really explore what the Battle of Long Island was like, who uh, sat through long days between fighting with little food, who ended up in a prison ship and had to defect to the British to get out. Um, some of those aspects of the war that I think a lot of the times I go to American Revolutionary talks or things like that, and people are really focused on battle strategies and which troops moved where. And what I really hadn't heard a lot of was the reality of what the humans in that war were really enduring and feeling and experiencing. And so Arthur really allowed that position to shine a little bit more than Nathaniel, who was really skirting the edge of it, so to speak. Um, Another factor was the Kalawi is one of my other characters, and he's neighbor to Arthur and Nathaniel, and he is part of a Shawnee clan. I stumbled across a book pretty early on by Colin Calloway about the Shawnees' involvement in the American Revolution. And then I put it down, and then I read a whole bunch of other books about different Native American tribes. And I finally reached out through my American Revolutionary Roundtable group and said, who should I talk to about the Native Americans being involved in the war? And they said I should talk to Colin Calloway. And I ended up on the phone with him. He was delightful. He pulled books from his bookshelf and sent them to me. And it really, he absolutely showed me that the Shawnee were just like us. Some of them wanted to join with the British, some of them wanted to join with the Americans, and a huge portion of them wanted to remain Shawnee.
Right.
They
Right.
also wanted independence, and that position was it was too important, I think, to exclude. So his story became one of the 4 primary voices.
Which I agree, that is important. And it is something that we don't hear a whole lot when we study the revolution. So it's nice to have that perspective included.
Right. And a perspective for them that doesn't include like scalping and stealing white people. I mean, that
Right.
that is just not the that's not necessary anymore. to do that. So, and then my
Right.
fourth voice is Suzanna, who is the love interest for Nathaniel, because we hear, those of us who study the American Revolution, we hear a lot about camp followers, which were women who, if you were on a farm with your husband and your husband went off to war, it was a little bit safer for you to perhaps go to be with him in the camp. You would get some food, you would get protection from the other soldiers. It was better than being alone on the farm. So we hear a lot about them, but what we don't hear a lot about are the women who were left in the cities and left to their
Right.
own devices. And so I read Cokie Roberts' wonderful book, Founding Mothers, and I read Revolutionary Mothers by Carol Birkin. And I thought, how have these women been so ignored? So using some of the women, using, it's a terrible word, taking from some of the women the things that I saw as really crucial to being supportive of the war, I started to do my own research on what the women were bringing into that conflict. And Susanna's voice allows me to show a woman who doesn't sit idly by in Philadelphia waiting for a husband to return, but instead finds her own little sense of chutzpah to contribute. And contribution
Right.
was a big factor in what a lot of the women were doing.
Right. So we have had a couple people ask about slavery and how that kind of played into the creation of the Declaration. Was that something that sort of held up the Declaration? Was it something that they really had to work through to get a final draft that everyone was happy with? What was the role there?
Right. So as everyone knows, the Declaration did not resolve that problem.
Hmm?
The original drafts, they had some conflicting statements in it. And I know we had a question that was sent ahead about where you would find some information about some of the original drafts of the Declaration. And there are a couple resources. One is the Library of Congress. I made a note to make sure I get it right. There's a Declaration resource that Harvard has put together, headed by Danielle Allen, Allen. And Danielle and her group have really gathered a lot of information together about, and I used it tremendously, or quite a bit, to figure out some bits and pieces about the Declaration. But they have some of the early drafts. They have copies of those. The Library of Congress certainly does some of the handwritten drafts. In fact, I think in some of her research, Danielle actually found an additional handwritten draft just a couple of years ago. But it doesn't, the Declaration, you're right, I see you chiming in there, Mitch, it does not address the problem. And here's the issue with it, is that some of those original early drafts that Jefferson had written, there were some conflicting comments in those list of grievances. He wanted to say that Britain, because Britain was kind of heading toward anti-slavery and abolishment before we were, that the king was going to take away the opportunity to have slaves. And then there was another comment about, how abolishment of slavery was going to be one of the essential things that we should have a right to do if we want to. And the way that that Jefferson had structured the sentences, they almost cancel each other out. Like, if you're hitting me, I can't tell you can't do that by hitting you. That's essentially what those two statements did. So, Jefferson wrote the draft of the Declaration of Independence, and then he had a group of 4 major editors that included Ben Franklin and John Adams, of course. And then they edited things out, and then it went back out to all of Congress. So, I mean, knowing what a few editors is like, I can't imagine having 55 rather, other editors. But it just didn't address the problem. And so the decision for me early on with this book was that I would show slavery within this book, but I would not address them addressing slavery.
Mm-hmm.
I have a section in which George Wythe and Nathaniel are looking at the document, and they're having a discussion about its construction. And Nathaniel has just come down into Virginia, and he's not really seen slavery at the level that he sees at Richard Henry Lee's house, for instance, in which there are over 200 slaves at the time. And so he is startled by it. He and George Wythe have a conversation about it, and George Wythe admits that the Declaration, although it may be a beginning, is certainly flawed because the men creating it are. And I think in this context for this book, it was the right approach. Now, for the Constitution, I'm heading that thing straight on. So I'll be covering that a lot more in the next book, A Letter of Introduction.
Okay, perfect. Did you, in your research, come across stories of individuals who were, excuse me, as I cannot spit this out tonight, who were staunch loyalists and then ended up changing their minds and became for separation from Britain?
Yeah, I mean, you did have that quite a bit. I mean, you had people on both sides that saw that change going on, and I think I have that. I touch on that a little bit when it comes to Nathaniel's parents. His mother is English and his father is German, but his mother's family is all back in England still. So to her, that is her king. So for Jane Martin, there is confusion there because someone who was supposed to be her king and someone who was protecting her clearly is not. And I think there's a lot of that happened at that time where it was really easy to begin on one side and then switch sides completely. I met with a school group here in Richmond a few months back, and I had them section off into 3 groups: those for the crown, those against the crown, and those on the fence. And then we went through the events of the first year of the war, and it was an all-girls school, and the girls could change sides anytime they wanted to. And it was really interesting to watch a group of modern, intelligent high school teenagers, which is exactly really the age group that a lot of soldiers were, flip. So many one girl, she was on every team almost twice within the hour of the class. Another girl, really, she was like staunch loyalist from the beginning, and no matter what happened, even when they were down to just the 2 of them and everyone else was on the other side of the room, they were still in this camp. And it's really interesting to watch that happen in real time when you're just throwing what would feel now as hypothetical events, but what is actually history events. It was really fascinating to watch, having had to put myself in those positions to begin with, to watch them do it too.
Definitely. Kind of highlights that we think we know exactly how we'd react.
Oh,
but
yeah.
when we really start thinking about it, it's not that simple.
It's not that simple.
Right. So one of the things that I think people are coming to understand a little bit better now is that loyalists were treated very harshly, and a lot of them were forced to flee.
Right.
Did you get any insight on times where neighbors were turning on their loyalist neighbors and kind of what was happening and what that was like for those involved?
Oh, yeah. I mean, even so I was driving down Cary Street here. I live in Richmond, Virginia, and I was driving down Cary Street, and I noticed that the West Elm store that's down there has been boarded up since the pandemic kicked in. And that was true of the Revolutionary time period too, that if you were a loyalist and you thought you might still maintain your home in the middle of Philadelphia, you might board it up before you left. And so I always thought it would be interesting to see it on a more street level like that. And so I do have a scene in the book in which Nathaniel comes into Philadelphia and he sees a family loading stuff into a carriage to leave, and the neighbor next to them is being spiteful and hateful. And she's looking up at a flag that has changed over one of the buildings that's clearly no longer hers. And there
Mhm.
were little things like that. I imagine, being in a tavern and you and 20 of your neighbors normally hang out there on a weekend, and suddenly you don't know who's loyalist and who's separated. Um, I mean, we do it now. Look at how hateful people can be online about knowing who's voting for whom. And I don't think it was any different back then. I
Right.
certainly the societal difference and the lack of phones and email and online world probably benefited a lot of people who wanted to escape in the middle of the night quietly. Um, but I like we were talking about. I grew up in Calgary, in Canada, and I have a very dear old family friend who I go and stay with on my way to go see my parents. And she was telling me she's a European loyalist. So there we are, me a DAR and she a European loyalist. Her family and my family both were centered in the Mohawk Valley region in New York. Mine stayed and fought, and hers went north into Canada and got land granted to them by the king for being loyalist. So I think that loyalist position is really interesting too. Um,
That is interesting.
yeah.
So, how long did it take for people in the farthest reaches of America to get word of the Declaration? And along those same lines, how long did it take for the king to get word of the Declaration?
Yeah, that's always my favorite. The king, I think of on July 4th, the day that they voted for the wording on the Declaration, which is actually what we celebrate. On July 4th of 1776, the king put in his notes, "Nothing of consequence happened today," which tells you exactly what he didn't know was going on. I think he didn't find out until like September or October that with the way that the word traveled across the pond by boat, it took so long to get there. But same in the colonies. When they did a lot of reading aloud was how you got some of the news. So July 4th,
Mhm.
they voted on the wording, and then they read it out loud on the steps of the State House in Philadelphia on July 8th. They still do a reenactment every year of it, which is really fun
Mhm.
to go to. I was there last year. It rained, so we had to do it indoors instead of out, but it's great. Everybody yells huzzah, and there's people in the crowd who can't stand the fact we're separating, and some people get hauled out of the auditorium. It was really fun. But so they read them out loud. July 9th, they read it out loud in New York, up in Bowling Green, and they read it around this giant statue of King George III. They read it out loud to
Mhm.
George Washington and the soldiers who were in the area, and the soldiers were so incensed by the time they got to grievance number 27, they tore down the statue of King George III and hacked it to pieces. And then they
Right.
hauled that statue all the way up to Litchfield, Connecticut, where Oliver Wolcott, one of the signers, was. He had it taken up there and he melted it down, and they turned it into bullets, which they shot back at the British. What a I think as far as early, late, I guess, as 1984 or something like that, they were still finding pieces of tail and head in farm fields up in Connecticut somewhere. Um, but yeah,
Interesting.
it took a long time for word to get out there. So, like my character Nathaniel, who's in Berks County, I mean, the Declaration might be signed and read aloud in Philadelphia on the 4th, but depends on where you are and what kind of methods you have. It could take a week or two, a couple days. So, yeah.
Right. Right. So one of the things that we teased that we were going to talk about tonight was lesser known facts from 1776. So
Yes.
what goodies do you have for us there?
Well, of course, the King George statue is one.
Mhm.
One of the ones that I loved that it was almost too funny to be true was the Congress during 1776 and 1775. They had a second set of books. So they would take a set of meeting minutes that they would ship to the king because he had to see what they did in all their meetings. And then they had a second set that they kept where they talked about all the stuff about whether or not they should separate. And laughably, they called it the secret journals. And I was just like, really, guys? Like, that was the best thing you could come up with, was the secret journals? So, but they have since been transcribed. I know the Library of Virginia has a copy, and I poured through it. And on August 2nd, it just says that the men signed the Declaration, and then it goes on to talk about some funds for a ship that was being commissioned for import and export. And it was really unclear about who it was for. So I absconded with that little tidbit for a ship that they hired for Nathaniel. But yeah, it's not very regular. The secret journals are not very regular in terms of their minutes and their voting and things like that, because they just simply got swept up with having to deal with a war all of a sudden. And so they weren't, even though the secretary, Charles Thompson, was the secretary, he wasn't all that good about keeping really very detailed notes. So some days will completely go unaccounted for. Some days are really detailed. But I thought that was an interesting surprise to come across the secret journals.
Definitely.
As interesting as the horse itself. The other little tidbit that I just loved, and I talked about it with a high school group that I just finished having a Zoom with a couple hours ago. They when they cleaned the Declaration, finally cleaned the darn thing. It had been so poorly treated over the last 200, almost 250 years. When they finally cleaned it in the 1980s, they discovered that there was a handprint on the Declaration of Independence. Down in the bottom left corner, it's about the size of a woman's hand. And because of methodology and best practices for reconstructing documents, they can't pull up some of it to do DNA testing or anything like that. So it's kind of unknown about how that handprint got there. And it's really very noticeable. So I came up with the way that handprint got there. So that little, for me, some of the surprises, the holes in history were some of the surprises, and that handprint was one of them.
Right.
But then there are just some very basic historical things that some of the historians were arguing about. Like, for instance, the Howe brothers, General Howe and Admiral Howe, who were running the British Army and the Royal Army and the fleet, they had previously fought with the Americans in the French and Indian War, and they had some American, I don't know what you would call it, fidelity, I guess. But here they were fighting in America, and during that whole first year of the war, there were multiple times in which General Howe had George Washington's army backed into a corner, and he refused to push it. And I remember reading in Barnett Schechter's The History of New York, which is a wonderful book. He was talking about in there about this very fact, that why would General Howe do that? He could have ended the revolution within the first few months. At the Battle of Long Island, he could have done it. He could have done it in Harlem Heights. He could have done it in White Plains, and he didn't do it at all. And Barnett Schechter, who was like one of the premier historians on the American Revolution, just threw up his hands and said, I have no idea. Why would a man do that? And I thought, why would a man do that? And again, that was a hole for me to fill, and I decided to make them part of the antagonist group. That, of course, They would want to prolong a war. They wouldn't have to go home to their horrible wives. They would be able to maybe make a few more bucks, and they'd be able to stay in a country that with soldiers, with people they actually preferred to the English, maybe.
Right. Lots of unknowns.
Lots of unknowns, yeah. And I think that the biggest surprise of all, the Shawnee were a surprise, the women's involvement was a surprise, but for me, the prison ships was the most heart-wrenching surprise. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I have been to revolutionary talks where they glorify battle and all the wonderful things that these men did. And then I came to find out that 4,500 men died on the battlefield, and between 11 and 18,000 died in prison ships. And
They were horrible.
it, we did not win this war by soldiers. No. And the revolution, I think that John Adams quote that the revolution was in the hearts and the minds of the American people was the real battle, that we switched those people from being a third, a third, a third to being more in line with separation by the time it was done.
Mm-hmm.
But the prison ships were just, oh my gosh, we have firsthand accounts, 2 different diaries. Joseph Dring is one of them. And it's just sickening to think that the Americans were not prisoners of war. They were subjects who had gone awry. And so their rules of warfare were not applicable here, which meant
Right.
so they decommissioned all these old ships and they put them in Wallabout Bay off the coast of Brooklyn in what is now the Brooklyn Naval Yards. And they emptied out the hulls and they stuck all the prisoners in. And the prison ship Jersey alone claimed 8,000 men. I mean, it's awful.
Wow.
It's awful. And to find out that, in all the teachings and all the different readings that I did, it took me a long time to get to the prison ship.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think that should be one of the things that we talk about the most with war, because I think we would have less war if we talked about the real ghastly truth of it instead of glorifying these men running in with flags. And no, that's not really.
Right.
If people gave up their lives and their fortunes, they gave them up in a horrific way.
Right. Okay, we have one last question for tonight, and Mick wants to know how many copies were made of the original Declaration and where are they?
Okay, so the original Declaration with all the signatures, there is only one. And that now is in the National Archives. But from that document, there were what we call broadsides, typeset broadsides. So the Dunlap broadsides were the first ones that were run, and those were created right around July 4th, just after the signing. They had a calligrapher come in, and Dunlap was the gentleman who actually typeset those, and those copies only have John Hancock's name typeset and Charles Thompson, the secretary, his name typeset. And there were 200 of those. As of, I think, 1982, 84, somewhere in there, or maybe it was 1990, there were only 83 copies. And then a guy went to a flea market and he bought a frame that he wanted to take home and use for $4. And in behind was a copy of one of the original Dunlap broadsides. It ended up selling for $3.8 million. I know, right? You're just like, oh my God, talk about a net profit. What's the name of the gentleman who wrote All in the Family and the producer and director? Someone I'm sure type it in. So he ended up buying it and he had a big truck built and he drove it all over the country and he gave it back to the country. He donated it in the end. So there's 84 of those. There's a few, from what I understand, though I don't know that I've actually seen an original Mary Catherine Goddard broadside. Those were printed and typeset in 1777. There were 200 of those as well, and those have all the names typeset on them. And it is the only Norman Lear. Thank you, Libby. Hi, Libby. Norman Lear was the guy who bought the Declaration and gave it back to the country. The Mary Catherine Goddard one, she volunteered to print the copies that had all the names typeset below. But one of the signers had not yet signed the original that she was working from. So Thomas McCain from Delaware is missing from the Mary Catherine Goddard broadside. But she was brilliant and she typeset her own name at the bottom. So if you're in the Boston area and you go and get a copy printed at Faneuil Hall, they have an antique printer there. and he's printing in the 18th
Eads
century. So,
into.
yeah, yeah, he is making a Catherine Goddard broadside.
Fantastic. And he does a great job.
He
He's
does, and
great.
I think they also make those here in Williamsburg at the print shop here. And Mary Catherine Goddard's print shop for me is always going to be based off the Williamsburg one because I went there and they had a gray cat named Benjamin, and so did Mary Catherine Goddard as a result.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was a lot of fun. And if
Thank
you are interested in Karen's book, you can buy that on our website, which is historycamp.org/online. You have a link there.
you.
And then next week, we will be talking with Dr. Sam Foreman, and he's going to talk to us about the smallpox epidemic of 1764 and some other epidemics during the colonial era. So that will be a good way to get some historical perspective on some of the things that we are dealing with right now. So join us next week at 8 o'clock, and we're hoping for no technical issues next week.
Thank you for managing that shift, Carrie, and for having me on tonight. It's been really fun.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, I hope
Good
people
night.
will drop by KarenHace.com and sign up for the newsletter. You can help me name the dog in the next book. That's my next giveaway coming up.
Perfect. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for coming.